And thanks, Gerrit and Saritza, for inviting me over to present the Danish National Spatial Planning Framework. So what I'll be dividing my presentation in 5 core themes: the context, historical background, foundations of the Danish planning system. I'll be talking about planning in different scales, not only the national strategy, but also what's happening at the regional and municipal level. Thereafter, the structure of planning and land use policy and governance. Then zooming out and probably addressing some of the factors shaping Danish spatial planning, which are also applicable to some other European countries, and wrapping it up with key features and lessons. So Denmark at a glance, we see on the left-hand side, right at the bottom of Scandinavia, but at the top of continental Europe. We see over here that it has 43,000 square kilometers, so it's roughly the size, the surface area of Maryland, Delaware, and probably Rhode Island if we add it up. 5.58 million inhabitants, so it's not that densely populated. 1/3 living in Greater Copenhagen, here towards the right. Over here, close to the Swedish border, we see on the left the Jutland Peninsula, which is largely unpopulated if we compare with Zealand, which is this island over here. Just mainly 3 core islands: Zealand, Funen, and over there, the mainland, Jutland. And the land use, mostly agricultural, but also some heathland, urban, 10%, and the 7% water bodies. So some interesting and very important aspects to know about the Danish government, the welfare system, because they relate very much to planning. So this is a thing to really keep in mind all throughout the presentation. Denmark is a parliamentary democracy, so basically comprised by government, the cabinet, the parliament, the legislative power, and the judicial is the courts. Denmark has been traditionally formed in recent decades by coalition governments. So we have a center-left coalition government right now, so 2011. But the last decade it was a liberal conservative coalition government ruling the country. So this played a very interesting role in terms of how planning was approached. I'll come back to that later on. Denmark is characterized by a Danish welfare system, which is basically summarized in a nutshell: free and equal access to education and health services to everybody. Subsidized by one of the highest taxation levels in the world, 48% of the GDP. A decentralized system of public administration. There's a very decentralized, also reflected in planning, where local authorities administer most of the total public expenditure. So a bit of the historical background. There was a first municipal reform in the 1970s, which was executive based on territorial considerations, very much related to geographical thinking. Denmark used to be comprised by over 1,000 parishes and also several hundred municipalities before this time. And the whole structure of the country was reconfigured in the 1970s, also as a response of the post-war Denmark, which was very much characterized by unbalanced development. Most of the wealth of the country was concentrated in the Copenhagen area again. And there were plenty of social and economic issues going on in the Jutland area. So this reform, the idea was actually to balance out these considerations based on functional relationships, also mobility and commuting patterns between municipalities. So again, geographical thinking. And the logic of this subdivision was one city, one municipality. So all this territorial subdivision that we see over here in this map is based on this spatial logic. And also, we can also understand this sort of structural reform, municipal reform, in terms of territorial synchrony, as put by Martin Heyer in the Netherlands, which is basically a means to differentiate state territoriality, to provide functional unity and operational coordination and coherence. So a state special project that took several years, even decades, to be implemented. Here we see its relationship, the relationship of this municipal reform to the Danish planning system. On the left, we have a Danish planning system characterized by the principle of framework control, where we have very well subdivided levels of planning: national, regional, municipal, and local, each one embedded into the other. And it could also be characterized or known as a Matryoshka system, also related to the way this Russian doll system, the way that the Dutch system was characterized also in the past, with several relationships to the Dutch system, as far as the way of administration was concerned in planning. Also, over here, another way to understand planning up to 2007, because this has all changed, and I will talk about these changes, planning as a spatial expression of the welfare state. So very much related to what I was talking about in the previous slide, the welfare state. And this was a means to actually, planning as a societal need to achieve equal development. So this premise of equality, this social democratic way of thinking that characterizes the Danish welfare state is very much related, also embedded in the traditional planning system. And the way it was defined by the EU Compendium of Spatial Planning and Policies in the 90s, that actually label or characterize several of the countries at that time in Europe, at that time the EU 11, was Danish planning system as a comprehensive integrated system. So what this basically means that there's a certain degree of horizontal and vertical integration amongst and between levels of government. And the way it could be defined is a systematic and formal hierarchy of plans from national to local, as we saw from this framework management approach, which coordinate public sector activity across different sectors, but focus more specifically on spatial coordination than economic development. So also, this is quite important to note because we see economic development probably will be more related to systems in Central Europe, in France, for instance, so the town and country planning approach, which is also in the UK quite different from this spatial coordination, comprehensive integrated approach in Denmark up until 2007, again, and we'll be talking about these changes. The foundations of the Danish planning system, which are still there right now, in a way, again, decentralization of planning responsibilities, comprehensive planning embedded within the different levels of government, and public participation. These are an extremely important component of the Danish planning system, providing awareness and understanding of the need for planning regulation in response to local needs. And let's go now into also still the foundations. This plan on the left was a very important plan that actually reflected this spatial expression of the welfare state that I just mentioned, in the sense that it was also based on a social-spatial logic, the hierarchical urban pattern. It took almost 15 years for this plan to be determined, but it had a lot of implementation potential. It's basically focusing on different centers, national centers, regional centers, local centers, each one depending on each other in terms of service, good and service provision. So this was this social spatial logic in order to be able to develop the whole side of Jutland in that case. And we see on top there, we zoom into the case of North Denmark, for instance, in this case, also very much reflect the social spatial logic, these hierarchies of cities where we see Aalborg at the middle, that's where our university is, and our planning school. And different other cities having different roles and different functions within this spatial structure, which was actually consolidating different regional plans published every 4 years from 1980 until 2005 was the last regional plan in the spatial sense, so to speak. And now we come to talk about the change. So there was a second municipal reform in 2007, which amalgamated municipalities and abolished the county level. And this is probably the most important feature of this reform. So in this case, there used to be 14 counties, they were abolished, and most of the taxes and responsibilities were rescaled. I'll discuss this. And 5 regions were prevailed or were formed basically for healthcare purposes. So the way to understand this reform was basically as a process geared towards managerial efficiency and economies of scale, overlooking geographical criteria. So in this way, quite different from the first reform that had a lot of spatial, it had an implicit spatial logic in it. Over here we see really a process of efficiency, a process of economies of scale, of saving. So rescaling of planning tasks and responsibilities, which has been labeled also by some commentators as centralized decentralization. Some of the tasks went to the national level, some others to the municipal level. And of course this system is not working anymore as a comprehensive integrated system. I'll discuss this now. So the scope and performance of the planning system changed in terms both of the planning conception. This welfare conception is no longer there anymore. Planning roles change as well. The spatial logic is not social any longer. It's more competitiveness oriented. Different development orientations over time, and of course very different institutional arrangements which no longer respond to the framework management approach that I discussed. So over here we have the 12 regional plans from the past. Some of the policies were actually rescaled to the national level in the form of enforcement, and several others, especially the land use tasks and responsibilities, to the municipal plans as of 2007. So we see this transition from this embedded system, which was the outcome of the first municipal reform, into this new system where we have a really close interaction between the national and municipal level. But then we have this regional level, which is basically, as I mentioned, 95% of this regional level is in charge of healthcare purposes in the country. And some minor tasks and responsibilities related to regional development plans, but which are not longer spatial in a sense. They're called in the legislation regional spatial plans, but they don't have any maps in them. It's basically related to competitiveness objectives, and very much also related to another act that is not the Planning Act, which is the Business Development Act related to regional growth forum, which actually is concerned with how to come up with competitiveness strategies in each of the 5 regions. So this is, in a nutshell, again, the whole of the Danish planning policy framework right now. Of course, it's quite difficult to actually focus on this. I'll discuss some of the actual, the core plans. We have here the types of plans at the national level, the spatial framework. We have national planning reports, national planning directives, and an overview of national interests regarding municipal plans. This framework is functioning in a very fusion, very consolidated way. Most of these are binding for local authorities, right, for the municipal and local level, and the national plan report is advisory. The regional plan that I mentioned is basically advisory and visionary, right? It's not spatial. And the local is very much concerned with land use, right? Policies, maps, land use regulations, maps and details of land use. Some examples of former national planning so that you can distinguish, right? This is the very spatially based sort of doing planning. 1992, the Danish Planning Act was established. Several other acts were put together in just one planning act by then. And it's the first time that we no longer see this spatial hierarchy approach. Now we see Denmark being opened up and focusing more on Copenhagen again, because there was too much of a focus on developing the rest of the country, and therefore Copenhagen in a way lagging behind in the 1980s. So we see a projection and seeing Copenhagen as an international metropolis. This is 20 years ago. And here we see also the report from 2000, where we see different concepts adopted also from the European spatial development perspective. We start talking about urban networks, about competitiveness clusters, right? In link with infrastructure in the country. So again, this former spatial notion of thinking on spatial hierarchy is no longer there, right? It's new concepts being adopted. And this is the last spatial report in Denmark of 2006, and the last in the spatial sense of that tradition of spatial planning, where we see also some of the concepts from the European spatial development perspective, like having functional dynamic zones of integration. For instance, here Copenhagen with a commuting area in Zealand, and on the left we see a functional million city for growth and competitiveness, extending most throughout the eastern side of the Jutland Peninsula. So again, the last map in the spatial sense. And what we have nowadays, there's a new plan report coming out, which is very much based on having a green focus, discussing very much aspects of sustainable growth, climate and energy, the open land, the countryside, and so forth, which is very much unrelated with the differentiated strategic approach that planning used to have in all these different reports from the 90s until 2006. And we have this other new tool at the national level, which is an instrument stating national sectoral policy interests and considerations for the municipal level, right? So again, with this rescaling, national plan became a bit more enforcing, so to speak, and less strategic. So in this case, and one of the interesting characteristics of this document is that the minister has the right and obligation to veto municipal planning proposals that contradict national interests. We see directives as well. This is another means, right, of municipalities to comply with national level objectives. The case of the Copenhagen Finger Plan, which dates back to 1947. That's spatial strategy from 47, which regulates land use in Greater Copenhagen's 34 municipalities, which is really the only form of actual regional spatial land use planning, so to speak, going on in Denmark right now. And what has regional spatial development planning been transformed into is, as I mentioned before, visionary scope, a focus on regional strengths for economic growth, mostly in accordance with business development strategies of the Business Development Act. So we see, for instance, this part of the country focusing on the core strengths of each of the municipalities embedded within that region. So it's no longer spatial in that sense, but here we say we have a profit in a way to focus on culture, to focus on the environment, on tourism, over here in terms of the university, in terms of IT, the IT sector. So very, very different way of doing planning at the regional level. And at the municipal level, lots of forms of planning are going on right now. And this would be extremely interesting to discuss just each one of them. We have, as I mentioned, traditional statutory land use planning, which was rescaled, consistent of general structure guidelines for land use and regulatory framework for local planning, all embedded in one document. We also have master planning going on in terms of suburban areas, right? Try to develop new suburban areas in some parts of the country. And then climate adaptation planning as well, which is not yet fully integrated in municipal planning, still treated as sectoral planning, but it's also going on at the municipal level. Yes, and then local plans, which serve as a legal basis for implementing any major development project. So we have local plans perceived as the main instrument to issue detailed planning regulations as means for planning control for building permits. And this is also one of the interesting features of this local planning is that all these plans are made available on the National Planning Information System, so all the citizens actually can access these plans and be able to comment on them in the public hearing process, which takes 8 weeks before the plan is adopted. So I just as a summary, probably one of the core lessons to keep, the way planning has evolved, there's an interplay between development orientations and planning roles. Over here we see from the 60s and 70s, mostly planning had a steering role in the country, focusing on equality by this social democratic approach to welfare. And thereafter in the 80s, there was a change towards a strategic planning, a new focus on appropriate development, and moving all the way right now until the 2010s, where we see probably this balancing approach, trying to balance sectoral agendas, but not really strategic nor steering. So quite hard to say what sort of development orientation these plans have currently. I won't go in detail into this. These are the factors shaping and reshaping spatial planning in Europe. There's been a lot being written about this. Political driving forces, environmental driving forces. Probably Denmark falls into several of these categories, particularly in the case of the structural reforms, obviously, and some changes in local governments, new modes of territorial policy integration. This has been going on in the country all the way from the 90s, but probably a bit more slowly in comparison with other European countries, because of the welfare state. To wrap it up, these two slides, key features for you to keep in mind. So Denmark has a plan-led system with strong means of development control. Local plans provide prior to any major development. It's a national sectoral steering going on right now, so not spatial, but rather sectoral, and also a means of veto to safeguard national sectoral policies. So this veto component is very important at the national level. And now instead of having comprehensive system throughout framework control, we have comprehensive local planning, mostly at the municipal level, going on with policies and land use planning and regulations embedded all in one document. And the feature of strong decentralization, which has been there all the way back from the 70s, but right now prevails also. Planning developed and adopted at the local level, public participation ensured, and no opportunities for appeals. So when a plan is adopted, there's no opportunity for appealing against the plan. And this contrasts quite a lot with other systems, such as the one in the UK, for instance. Some of the key lessons, there's been a transition from welfarism to neoliberalism, as is happening in many countries in Europe. And that means, in terms of development perspectives, from equal development towards appropriate development. In this case, we're talking more about competitiveness approaches. Transition from framework control, this embedded system I mentioned, to centralized decentralization, right? The county level is not there any longer. So therefore, we talk more about national and regional planning being more spaceless, so to speak. Not really spatial, but spaceless, right? A divergence from the comprehensive integrated tradition that I mentioned at the beginning, so less to do with spatial coordination in that sense. And also spatial planning regarded more as a cost than an asset, probably at the national level, at least since 2001 with the liberal conservative coalition, the right-wing government that ruled Denmark in the past 10 years. Thereby, probably, I don't want to be that pessimistic, but there's been a loss of political clout in the sense that the government support of other sectors has indirectly decreased the strategic spatial conception of planning at the national and regional levels. There's a lot of readings of the different components of planning that we've been dealing with in the past 3 or 4 years with my colleague Stienmark in our university. We're talking about national planning, regional planning, municipal planning, local planning. So the transformation in each one of these levels, and I think this opportunity we had here to bring everything together in one document was extremely challenging, but we really appreciate that, because that really made us, just to make a strong effort to actually put everything together in one compilation was extremely difficult. Yeah, thank you very much.